In the Imperium of Man, death is mercy. The Penal Legions exist because mercy is expensive. I learned this truth in a processing station on Varsavia Prime, standing in a line of 3,000 condemned souls while a servitor stapled an identification plate to my sternum. The pain was immediate and absolute, but I did not scream. Screaming wastes oxygen, and the overseer had already beaten 2 men unconscious for hyperventilating. The plate was cold against the exposed meat of my chest, and I could feel the serial number burning itself into my consciousness with each heartbeat. 7 of 43, Delta Sigma 9. That is what I am now. Not a name, not a man. A designation waiting to be expended. The others in line swayed like crops before harvest. Some weeping, others silent with the kind of shock that hollows you out from the inside. I recognized a woman 3 positions ahead. She had worked in the water reclamation plant near my tenement block. I did not know her crime. I did not know my own. Not really. The trial lasted 40 seconds. The judge, a hunched thing more augmetic than human, never looked at me. His Vox grill crackled something about seditious negligence and failure to report suspicious behavior. And then the gavel fell like an execution round. I had not reported my neighbor when I heard him praying to something that was not the God Emperor. That was my sin. Silence. They did not kill me for it. They made me valuable instead. The transport ship smelled like a mass grave that had learned to fly. We were packed into cargo holds designed for ammunition crates. Standing room only, our bodies pressed so tightly together that when the woman beside me died somewhere over the 3rd day in transit, she remained upright, held in place by the sheer density of human flesh. Her eyes stayed open. I watched them glaze over, watched the moisture dry from them until they looked like dirty glass. No one removed her. There was nowhere to put her. We simply stood there, the living and the dead, compressed into the same miserable taxonomy. The air was so thick with the stench of waste and fear sweat that breathing felt like drowning. Some men tried to start prayers, the old litanies to the Emperor we had learned as children, but their voices died in the darkness. The Emperor does not hear prayers from cargo holds. Perhaps he never did. Perhaps that is a mercy too expensive for the likes of us. I pressed my forehead against the cold metal wall and felt the vibration of the ship's engines through my skull, a mechanical heartbeat that mocked the failing rhythms of the bodies around me. This was not punishment. Punishment implies judgment, implies that someone cared enough to measure your transgression against a standard. This was processing. We were being transported the same way you transport spoiled meat to a rendering plant. When the doors finally opened, the light was violent enough to blind. Penal World Designate Corvast 9. That is what the data slate said when they unloaded us onto the landing field. The planet's sky was the color of an infected wound, yellow and purple and swollen with toxins. The air tasted like burning plastic and copper. My lungs rejected it on the first breath, and I vomited onto the rockcrete, adding my bile to the stains of thousands who had arrived before me. A commissar walked the line, his boots clicking with metronomic precision, and he did not look at us as individuals. He looked at us the way a butcher looks at livestock, assessing yield and quality with the dispassion of someone who has done this countless times before. His greatcoat was immaculate. His face was young, almost beautiful, and that made it worse somehow. There was no sadistic pleasure in his eyes, no rage, no contempt, just administrative efficiency. He stopped in front of a man who was still vomiting, unable to stop, his body purging itself of everything it had left. And the commissar drew his bolt pistol with the casualness of a man checking his chronometer. The shot removed the man's head from his shoulders in a spray of red that painted 5 of us standing nearby. The body collapsed. The commissar holstered his weapon and continued walking. "Anyone else experiencing atmospheric incompatibility?" he asked. His voice was pleasant, almost conversational. No one answered. We had learned. They fitted us with control collars in a facility that might have been a warehouse or a torture chamber, or both. The collar locked around my throat with a pneumatic hiss, and immediately I felt the neural interface spikes punch through skin and muscle to nestle against my cervical vertebrae. The pain was exquisite, a symphony of nerve endings screaming in perfect harmony, but again I did not make a sound. The tech priest performing the installation did not have a face anymore, just a bronze mask with a single red lens where an eye should be. His mechadendrites moved with surgical precision, calibrating the collar's kill switch mechanism while binary cant whispered from speakers built into his chest. I did not understand the words, but I understood their meaning. This device could stop my heart with a signal. It could flood my nervous system with agony so pure that death would feel like waking from a nightmare. It could detonate with enough force to remove my head and both shoulders, transforming me into a red mist and a warning to others. The tech priest stepped back, satisfied with his work, and moved to the next penitent in line. I raised my hand to touch the collar and felt warm blood trickling down from where the spikes had entered my flesh. The woman beside me, the one from the water plant, was weeping silently, her shoulders shaking but no sound emerging. I wanted to tell her it would be all right. I wanted to offer some comfort, but I had learned on Varsavia Prime that lies are just another form of screaming, another waste of oxygen. They gave us laser guns that had been manufactured before my grandfather was born. The barrel of mine was pitted with corrosion, the power pack cracked and leaking battery acid that burned my palm when I gripped it. The stock was wrapped in tape that had gone black with old blood and newer blood and substances I chose not to identify. It smelled like every terrible thing humanity has ever done to itself, concentrated into one object and placed in my hands. The drill sergeant, a massive slab of scar tissue and augmetic limbs, showed us how to fire it exactly once. He pointed it at a target dummy 50 meters downrange and pulled the trigger. The last bolt punched a hole through the dummy's center mass, and the sergeant grunted his approval. "The weapon functions," he said. "You will function the same way. Point toward the enemy, pull the trigger, die efficiently." That was the entirety of our training. 3 minutes of instruction and a philosophical statement about the nature of our existence. We were given no ammunition for practice. Every charge pack was precious. Every shot accounted for in some distant ledger maintained by administratum functionaries who would never smell promethium smoke or feel last fire cook the air around them. Our lives were worth less than the ammunition we carried. This was explained to us not as cruelty, but as simple resource management. A charge pack could kill an enemy. We could only die once. The barracks were designed to make sleep impossible. 300 of us packed into a space meant for 70, sleeping in shifts on bare metal bunks that were too short and too narrow for human bodies. The lights never fully dimmed. The Vox speakers in the ceiling broadcast imperial hymns at irregular intervals, sometimes screaming them at volumes that made your teeth ache, sometimes whispering them just quietly enough that you strained to hear the words and could not rest. The floor was always wet with something. Condensation or urine, or the discharge from infected wounds that no medici would treat. We were not worth medicine. Medicine could save a guardsman's life, a real soldier whose existence held value beyond the immediate expenditure. We were meant to rot slowly enough to reach the battlefield, but quickly enough that survival became impossible. I watched infections spread through the barracks like faith through a congregation, men and women developing pustulent sores that wept yellow fluid and smelled like spoiled meat. Some died in their bunks. Most lived, their suffering prolonged by bodies too stubborn to quit. Immune systems fighting wars they could not win, but refusing to surrender. The commissars would inspect us each morning, walking the rows with their hands behind their backs, and occasionally they would stop beside a bunk and make a note on their data slates. Those marked never returned from the day's labor details. No one asked where they went. We knew. Failed inventory must be disposed of. My first work detail was in the Promethium refinery on Corvast's equator. We marched for 6 hours through terrain that was simultaneously frozen and burning, the ground covered in chemical ice that gave off toxic fumes when it sublimated in the heat of day. Men collapsed during the march. The commissars shot them where they fell. Their bodies were left for the planet's scavengers, things that looked like rats crossed with centipedes, their chittering screams following our column like a mocking choir. The refinery itself was a cathedral to human suffering, a massive structure of rusted iron and broken dreams where the temperature inside the processing chambers exceeded 50 degrees Celsius. We worked 18-hour shifts, loading promethium barrels that weighed more than we did, our hands blistering and bleeding, our backs compressing under the weight until several men's spines simply gave out with wet, cracking sounds that echoed through the facility. The overseers were servitors, lobotomized criminals whose brains had been scooped out and replaced with logic engines that knew only productivity quotas and punishment protocols. They beat us with shock mauls when we slowed. They did not hate us. They did not feel anything. They were the Imperium's perfect employees, incapable of mercy or doubt or the dangerous thoughts that had condemned us all. I lasted 3 weeks in the refinery before I understood the truth. We were not there to refine promethium. The servitors could have done that work more efficiently, more safely, with none of the waste that came from human exhaustion and human error. We were there to die in proximity to something useful, to sanctify the promethium with our suffering so that when it burned in the tanks of the Imperium's war machines, it carried with it the weight of human sacrifice. Every barrel we loaded was baptized in our blood and in sweat and the tears of men who had forgotten how to cry. Every drop of fuel that would eventually propel a Lehman Russ into battle or cook heretics in a purging flame had been touched by hands that the Imperium had deemed worthless. This was not punishment. This was transubstantiation. We were being converted from useless matter into useful grief. Our pain refined and concentrated and made sacred through the simple act of suffering in service to something larger than ourselves. The Emperor does not want our faith. He wants our anguish. That is the fuel that keeps the Imperium burning. The woman from the water plant died on the 31st day. Her name had been Sarah. I remembered it suddenly, standing over her body in the barracks while the others stepped around her to reach their bunks. Sarah Kolvath. She had 3 children. She had once given me water during a rationing crisis, a cup of clean water from her own allotment, and had refused payment because she said neighbors should help neighbors. Her crime had been miscalibrating a purification filter, allowing 0.03% more contaminants into the supply than regulations permitted. An honest mistake, a moment of exhaustion, the kind of thing that happens to everyone who works too long under too much pressure. They had sentenced her to this. Her body was covered in chemical burns from the promethium, her hands swollen to twice their normal size, her face so blistered that her features had become abstract. She had died choking on fluid that her lungs had produced in response to the toxic atmosphere, drowning in herself while 50 people slept within arm's reach. I knelt beside her and closed her eyes, the only kindness I could offer. A commissar appeared at my shoulder, silent as a ghost, and I tensed, waiting for the bolt pistol, waiting for the punishment that would come from this unauthorized act of humanity. But he simply made a note on his data slate and walked away. The body was removed during the next shift change. Sarah Kolvath became a line item in a disposal report. Her children would never know what happened to her. Perhaps they were already dead too, guilt by association having claimed them when their mother was sentenced. Or perhaps they still lived, believing she had abandoned them, their hearts hardening against a parent who had simply vanished one day without explanation. Both possibilities were equally terrible. The first deployment came without warning. We were awakened by klaxons that sounded like the screaming of brazen bulls, driven from our bunks by commissars wielding shock mauls and barking orders that contradicted each other in the chaos. 30 minutes to don our gear, 15 minutes to form ranks, 5 minutes loaded onto bulk landers that smelled like fear and gun oil and the recycled air of 1,000 previous deployments. No one told us where we were going. No one told us what we would face. The pilot's voice crackled over the Vox system, a bored litany of atmospheric entry procedures and landing zone coordinates that meant nothing to us. I sat strapped into a restraint harness beside men whose faces I had memorized over the past weeks, men whose names I had deliberately not learned, because learning names meant admitting they were human, and admitting they were human meant mourning them when they died. The man to my left was missing 3 fingers on his right hand, lost in the refinery to a processing blade. The woman across from me had burns covering 70% of her body. The boy beside her could not have been more than 16 years standard, his eyes already dead, already resigned to whatever came next. We did not speak. Speech was waste. We simply waited while the lander dropped through the atmosphere of whatever world we were being fed into, the hull shaking so violently that my teeth clacked together and I tasted blood from a bitten tongue. The landing zone was a crater filled with corpses. Our lander touched down on a carpet of bodies so thick that the landing gear compressed them into paste. Ancient dead and fresh dead, and those not quite dead who still moved weakly beneath the weight of subsequent arrivals. The assault ramp dropped, and we poured out into air that was on fire. Lost bolts crossing the space above our heads in a web of lethal light. I ran because the man behind me was running, because standing still meant being trampled, because forward was the only direction that existed anymore. The ground was soft with death. My boots sank into flesh that had been there long enough to liquefy. I slipped, went down on one knee, felt my hand plunge into something that had once been a torso, and pushed myself up with borrowed ribs grinding against my palm. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Muzzle flashes in the smoke, the scream of projectile weapons mixed with the distinctive crack of last fire and the deeper roar of something heavier, something that made the air itself shudder. I fired my laser gun at shadows, not aiming, not thinking, just pulling the trigger, because that was what we had been told to do. Point toward the enemy. Pull the trigger. Die efficiently. A commissar stood on a pile of rubble to my right, his bolt pistol in one hand and a chainsword in the other. And he was laughing. Actually laughing. His voice cutting through the chaos with the clarity of madness or faith or the space where those two concepts merge into something transcendent. "Forward, you damn dogs," he screamed, his words punctuated by the wet chewing sound of his chainsword meeting flesh. "Earn your deaths. Make them mean something." He killed 3 of our own soldiers who tried to take cover behind the rubble, his bolt pistol barking 3 times in quick succession, 3 heads exploding like overripe fruit. There is no retreat. There is no surrender. There is only the Emperor's mercy, and you are too worthless to receive it. A mortar round landed 10 meters from his position, the blast wave picking him up and throwing him 30 meters through the air. But he landed on his feet somehow, still laughing, his greatcoat on fire and his face a ruin of burns and exposed bone. He raised his weapons again and charged toward the enemy line alone, a one-man cathedral of violence and devotion. And we followed him because what else could we do? The collar around my neck would detonate if I ran. The Imperium behind me would execute me if I survived. Forward was the only direction. Death was the only destination. I killed my first human being in that battle. Not an orc or a heretic or something alien another. A human being, a woman wearing the uniform of a planetary defense force, her insignia marking her as a lieutenant or a captain or something that had once meant rank and responsibility. She came at me through the smoke with a bayonet fixed to her lace gun, her face twisted into something beyond rage or fear, an expression that existed in the space where all human emotion compresses into pure survival instinct. We met in the space between 2 burning vehicles, and there was no technique, no training, no artistry to it. We simply tried to kill each other with the desperation of animals in a trap. Her bayonet caught my left arm, punching through the meat of my bicep and grinding against bone. I felt the blade scrape against my humerus with a sensation that was somehow worse than pain, a wrongness that made my entire nervous system rebel. I brought my laser gun up, the barrel pressed against her stomach, and fired. The shot went through her at close range, cooking her internal organs and cauterizing the wound simultaneously so that she did not bleed as much as she steamed, smoke rising from the exit wound in her back. She looked at me with surprise, as if this outcome had not occurred to her as a possibility. And then she died, while still standing, her body taking several seconds to understand what her brain already knew. I pushed her away and she fell, her bayonet pulling free from my arm with a wet sound, and I stood there breathing hard and staring at what I had done. The Commissar's voice crackled through the vox bead they had implanted in my ear, a gift I had not asked for and could not remove. Penal designate 7743 Delta Sigma 9 status. His voice was calm, almost gentle, the voice of a physician inquiring about symptoms. I looked down at my arm, blood pouring from the puncture wound, and then looked at the body at my feet, and I did not know how to answer. What was my status? I was a murderer now, not by judicial decree, but by my own hand. I had ended a life. The woman at my feet had probably been defending her world from invasion, fighting for her home and her people, and all the things we are told matter. And I had killed her because I had been commanded to, because my choices had been reduced to binary simplicity. Kill or die. Functional, I finally said, the only word that seemed appropriate. The Commissar's laughter filled my ear. Good. Advance to grid reference 779. Enemy fortification requires clearance. Clearance. The euphemism was almost beautiful in its efficiency. What he meant was that someone needed to run toward an enemy strong point and die in sufficient numbers that the enemy would exhaust their ammunition or reveal their positions or simply become so distracted by the slaughter that real soldiers, valuable soldiers, soldiers whose lives mattered, could advance and complete the actual objective. We were the distraction. We were the expendable attention, the human chaff thrown into the enemy's harvest so that others could reap the actual crop. I advanced toward grid reference 779er with 43 other penal designates. We moved through a landscape that had been transformed into surrealist art. Corpses arranged in patterns that suggested meaning but communicated only chaos. The fortification was a bunker built into the side of a hill, its firing slits vomiting heavy stubber fire that cut through our ranks like a reaper's scythe through wheat. Men died in pieces, their bodies coming apart under the impact of mass reactive rounds, their screams cut short by the sudden absence of the organs required for screaming. The woman with the burns took a round through her chest that removed her spine and most of her ribcage, transforming her into a grotesque puppet that collapsed in segments. The boy's head simply vanished, there one moment and gone the next, leaving a body that ran 3 more steps before understanding it was dead. I hit the ground and crawled, my wounded arm dragging uselessly, my laser gun held in my right hand as I tried to find cover that did not exist. The earth around me erupted in geysers of dirt and shrapnel as mortars walked across the approach, each impact closer than the last. The enemy artillery trying to find their range on targets that were not worth the shells being expended but dying anyway. Because that was the point. That was the entire purpose of our existence. The collar around my neck began to heat. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the steady warmth of a mechanism activating. I realized with perfect clarity that I was about to die, not from enemy fire but from the Imperium's own systems, that someone somewhere had determined that I was no longer advancing quickly enough or that my survival had exceeded its expected parameters. The heat increased, became pain, became agony that made the bayonet wound in my arm feel like a gentle caress by comparison. I screamed, my voice joining thousands of others screaming across the battlefield, a chorus of the damned reaching its crescendo. And then the heat stopped. The collar cooled. The pain faded to a memory. I lived, and that was somehow worse than dying would have been, because now I understood the full scope of my powerlessness. They could kill me whenever they wanted. They could hurt me whenever they wanted. They could allow me to live, and that allowance was not mercy, but simply the decision to squeeze more utility from my existence before discarding me. I was not a soldier. I was a mechanism, a thing with moving parts that had not yet broken in a way that required my disposal. The bunker fell when the real soldiers arrived. Astra Militarum, proper regiments with proper training and equipment that functioned. Their advance covered by Chimera transports and supported by a Lehman Russ whose battle cannon spoke once and removed the bunker from existence in a flash of light and a wave of overpressure that knocked me unconscious. I woke in a triage station, my arm roughly bandaged and my collar humming with low-power standby mode. Around me lay the survivors of the assault, perhaps 20 of the 300 penal designates who had been deployed. We did not speak to each other. There was nothing to say. A Medici servitor moved through the wounded with mechanical precision, its optics scanning injuries and determining priority. It passed me without stopping, my wounds deemed insufficient to warrant treatment, and I watched it administer a fatal overdose of painkillers to a man whose intestines were visible through a tear in his abdomen. The The man's eyes widened, then glazed, then closed. Efficient, merciful even, in the only way the Imperium understands mercy. I looked at my bandaged arm and wondered if the wound would become infected, if I would die slowly of sepsis over the next weeks, my body rotting from the inside out. The thought did not frighten me. Fear requires the belief that your life has value worth protecting. I had left that belief somewhere in the mud of the approach to grid reference 779er. They deployed us again 2 days later. The wound in my arm had developed a fever, the flesh around the puncture hot and swollen and leaking pus that smelled like sweet corruption. I could not fully extend the arm, could not grip my laser gun properly with that hand. But the Commissar who inspected our ranks simply made a note on his data slate and moved on. Functionality was a spectrum. As long as I could walk and hold a weapon with one hand, I remained useful. The deployment was to a different grid reference on a different part of the same planet, or perhaps a different planet entirely. They never told us, and the worlds began to blur together into one endless battlefield with different geography but identical purpose. This time we were clearing a manufactorum that had been overrun by enemy forces, room-to-room fighting in corridors so narrow that the dead could not fall, and simply stood propped against the living until both achieved the same final state. The enemy was better armed than we were, better trained, better everything, except more numerous. We drowned them in bodies. For every one of theirs that fell, 10 of ours died. But we had 10,000 to spend, and they did not. Mathematics written in blood and screaming. I killed 7 more people in that manufactorum. I stopped counting after 7 because the numbers lost meaning. They blurred together into one continuous act of murder that lasted hours or days. Time became unreliable, measured only in the intervals between finding new ammunition and the moments of brief unconsciousness when blood loss or exhaustion claimed me. I fired my laser gun until the barrel warped from heat, then picked up another from a corpse and continued. I stabbed a man with a broken piece of railing, pushing it through his eye socket until I felt resistance, and then pushing harder until the resistance gave way. I strangled a woman with my bare hands, my infected arm screaming but somehow finding the strength to maintain pressure on her throat until she stopped thrashing. I did these things not with rage or hatred, but with the mechanical precision of a servitor. My humanity compressed into something small and hard and distant, a kernel of awareness that watched from far away and no longer recognized the thing my body had become. When the manufactorum was finally secured, when the last enemy soldier was dead and the building silent except for the moaning of the wounded, I sat down in a pool of blood that was not my own and stared at my hands. They were black with dried blood and newer blood and substances I could not identify. The fingers would not stop shaking. I tried to make them stop, clenching them into fists and then releasing them, but the tremor continued, a frequency that resonated with something broken inside me. A guardsman walked past, a real soldier with clean equipment and eyes that had not yet learned what mine knew, and he looked at me with something I could not parse, not pity, not respect, perhaps disgust, or perhaps simple recognition of the gulf that existed between his existence and mine. He was a soldier. I was waste that had learned to hold a weapon. We both served the Emperor, but we did not serve the same purpose. He moved on without speaking, and I remained sitting in the blood, and somewhere distant I heard a Commissar calling for survivors to form up for extraction. I stood because standing was required. I walked because walking was commanded. I left pieces of myself in that manufactorum, intangible things like hope and identity, and the belief that any of this mattered beyond the immediate survival of the next minute and the minute after that. What remained was efficient. What remained was functional. What remained was exactly what the Imperium wanted. The wound in my arm killed the man beside me. We were in the transport back to Corvast 9 when the infection finally reached the terminal stage, my arm swollen to grotesque proportions. Black lines of sepsis spreading up toward my shoulder like cracks in porcelain. I was delirious, fever cooking my brain until reality became negotiable, and in my delirium I reached out and touched the man beside me, my infected hand brushing against an open wound on his face. He died 3 days later, his body consumed by the same bacterial infection that was eating mine, and they burned his corpse in the barracks incinerator while we watched. No one blamed me. Blame requires intention, requires the belief that I had chosen to spread the infection rather than simply being a vector for it. I was a biological weapon that no one had bothered to aim. The medical, who finally treated my arm, did so with the same enthusiasm a tech priest might display while repairing a broken servitor. He cut away the infected tissue with a surgical saw, removed a section of muscle that had necrotized, and cauterized the wound with a hand flamer that filled the air with the smell of burning pork. He did not use anesthetic. Anesthetic was for soldiers whose pain mattered. I screamed until my throat bled, my body arching against the restraints they had used to hold me down. And the medicae worked with the steady precision of someone who had done this thousands of times and would do it thousands more. When he finished, my arm was a ruin of scar tissue and exposed tendon. Barely functional, but functional enough. That was the standard. Not health, not wholeness. Just sufficient integrity to continue serving until the next breakdown. I survived 11 more deployments. Each one blurred into the next, a continuous nightmare without clear transitions or memorable events. Just an endless sequence of running and shooting and dying and somehow not dying. Not yet. Not quite yet. My survival becoming its own form of torture, because each morning I woke to discover I was still alive. And each morning that discovery felt like a punishment. We were deployed to ice worlds, where the cold burned like fire, and fire worlds where the heat froze you from the inside out. We fought orcs whose laughter sounded like the gears of broken machinery, their joy in battle so pure and so terrible that I envied them. We fought heretics who prayed to gods I would not name even in my thoughts, their bodies twisted by powers that made our suffering look like gentle mercy. We fought other humans, separatists and rebels, and people fighting for their independence from the Imperium. And those were the worst, because I could see myself in their eyes, could see the desperate belief that resistance mattered, that fighting back against the machine that was devouring them all could somehow change their fate. I killed them anyway. I killed them all, because the alternative was the collar activating, because the alternative was the Commissar's bolt pistol, because the alternative was simply not an alternative at all. The Penal Legion existed to teach a lesson, not to us. We were beyond teaching, beyond learning anything except how to die more slowly. The lesson was for everyone else. Every hive citizen who watched us march in chains, every guardsman who saw us used as mine clearers and ammunition sinks, every planetary governor who observed our deployment and understood what awaited those who displeased the administratum. We were not punishment. We were prophecy. We were the future that awaited anyone who stepped even slightly out of line, who questioned even the smallest aspect of imperial doctrine, who allowed even the briefest moment of independent thought to escape their lips. The Imperium does not need to execute dissidents when it can transform them into warnings, when it can parade them through the streets in chains before shipping them to wars they cannot win and deaths they cannot escape. Fear, I had learned, was the Imperium's most efficient weapon, not the fear of death. Death was too simple, too final, too much like mercy. The fear of this, the fear of being reduced to a number on a data slate, a piece of expendable ammunition marked for deployment and eventual disposal. The fear of suffering meaningfully, your pain rendered sacred through its service to something vast and uncaring and eternal. There were moments when men broke completely, when the armor of numbness that protected us all from the reality of our existence suddenly shattered, and they remembered they were human, remembered they had been something other than this. And the weight of that remembering crushed them. I watched a man named Kalos, or at least that was the name he whispered to himself when he thought no one was listening, suddenly start screaming during a deployment, not the screaming of pain or fear, which we had all become accustomed to, but the screaming of someone who had just woken from a nightmare into something worse. He dropped his laser gun and simply stood in the middle of a firefight, his hands pressed to his head, screaming words that might have been a name or prayer or the last coherent thought his mind produced before it tore itself apart. A Commissar put a round through his head, the execution so quick and so casual that it barely registered as an event. The screaming stopped. The body fell. We stepped over it and continued advancing because stopping was not permitted and mourning was waste. But I understood what had broken Kalos. I felt it pressing against my own consciousness every waking moment. The terrible knowledge that this was not temporary, that there was no end except death, that every day survived was just another day closer to the deployment that would finally consume me. Hope was the enemy. Acceptance was survival. And the space between those two states was where Kalos had lived before he died. The Imperium's greatest fear was not that we would die. Death was the expected outcome, the statistical certainty that had been calculated and accepted before we ever reached our first deployment. The Imperium's greatest fear was that we would live, that we would survive deployment after deployment, that our bodies would prove too stubborn to break, that we would outlive our sentences and become something unclassifiable, something that existed in the space between penal designation and full humanity. They had no procedures for this. The system was designed for throughput, not retention. We were meant to be consumed at a steady rate, our numbers replenished by fresh convictions, the machine maintaining equilibrium through continuous sacrifice. But occasionally, inevitably, someone survived long enough that their continued existence became a bureaucratic problem. I knew of 3 such cases during my time, men who had been deployed 50 times, 100 times, who had become walking scar tissue held together by spite and the failure of the universe to kill them despite countless opportunities. They were marked in the administratum's ledgers as anomalies. They were studied by commissars trying to understand what defect had allowed their survival. And then, quietly, they disappeared, not in battle, not in any official capacity, but simply vanished from the rolls one day, their numbers reassigned to fresh meat, their existence erased as if they had never survived at all. I met one of them before he disappeared. His designation was so long, had been modified and extended so many times, that he no longer remembered the beginning. He had fought for 17 years. His body was a topographical map of violence. Every visible surface marked by scars or burns, or the puckered tissue where augmetic components had been installed and then removed when he proved too damaged for even mechanical salvation. He sat in the corner of the barracks, and the other penal designates gave him space, not out of respect, but out of superstitious fear. He had survived what should have killed him 1,000 times. He was either blessed or cursed. No one wanted to discover which. I approached him one night when sleep was impossible, when the Vox speakers were playing hymns at a volume just below painful, and I asked him the question that haunted me. Did it get easier? He looked at me with eyes that were not quite sane, that had seen things I would eventually see but had not yet witnessed, and he smiled. No, he said, it gets worse. Every day you survive is another day you understand more clearly what you are, and what you are is not human anymore. You're a ghost wearing skin, a thing that should have died but didn't, and the universe hates you for it. He leaned closer, his breath smelling like decay and the cheap protein paste they fed us. They'll kill me soon. I can feel it. I've become inefficient. I've survived so long that my existence raises questions, and questions are dangerous. Better to dispose of me quietly than let anyone wonder if escape is possible. He was gone the next morning. His bunk was empty, his designation erased from the duty roster. No one asked what happened to him. We all knew. I began to understand the true purpose of our existence during my 43rd deployment, in a moment of clarity that came while I was pinned down by enemy fire in the ruins of what had once been a cathedral. The building's architecture suggested it had been dedicated to the god emperor, though which aspect or interpretation was unclear from the rubble. Around me lay 17 other penal designates, all dead, their bodies arranged in patterns that suggested they had been trying to spell something with their corpses before dying, though I could not parse the message. Above me, somewhere in the smoke and the screaming, I could hear Vox traffic between actual Imperial officers, Astra Militarum commanders coordinating the real assault while we died in the foreground. Penal wave has successfully drawn enemy fire, one voice said. Clinical and detached. Heavy weapon positions identified. Commencing artillery barrage on designated coordinates. And I realized, lying there in the mud and the blood and the broken stone, that we had never been meant to capture this position. We had never been meant to succeed at any objective beyond the revealing of enemy dispositions. We were biological sensor equipment. We advanced, and where we died in the greatest numbers marked the location of the most dangerous threats. The Imperium watched us from orbit, from command centers, from positions of absolute safety, and they used our deaths as data points in calculations that would result in actual victory achieved by actual soldiers whose lives had actual value. We were not warriors. We were not even sacrifices in any meaningful sense. We were measurement tools. Our lives quantified the enemy's strength so that the Imperium could spend its valuable resources more efficiently. The knowledge should have broken me. Instead, it crystallized something that had been forming in my consciousness since Varsavia Prime. Since the moment the identification plate had been stapled to my sternum, I was not a person anymore. I was a system component. I was a data point in a calculation too vast for my comprehension. And the system was working exactly as designed. There was no cruelty here, not in the sense of intentional sadism or unnecessary suffering. There was only efficiency. The Imperium had determined that executing its criminals was wasteful, that their deaths could be rendered productive if properly directed. And so, it had created the mechanism for that direction. The Penal Legions were not a failure of justice or a perversion of military doctrine. They were both justice and military doctrine functioning at peak efficiency. Their purposes merged into a single continuous process that converted transgression into territorial gain, guilt into ammunition, human suffering into imperial victory. Understanding this did not free me. Understanding this was just another form of imprisonment, a cognitive cage that made resistance impossible because resistance implied there was something to resist against, some flaw in the system that could be exploited or reformed. But there was no flaw. There was only function. The artillery barrage killed the enemies who had been killing us, and also killed the 4 of us who had survived long enough to witness it. I lived because I was partially sheltered by a collapsed pillar, because my body happened to be in the exact position where the blast wave split around an obstacle, because randomness momentarily favored my continued existence. The others were atomized, their bodies converted from solid matter to red mist in the span of a microsecond. I pulled myself from the rubble, my hearing gone, replaced by a high-pitched whine that would persist for days, and I staggered through the cathedral ruins toward the rally point. Because staggering toward rally points was what I did, was all I did, was the single skill I had perfected across 43 deployments. A commissar was waiting there, counting survivors with the same enthusiasm a merchant might count spoiled goods. His lips moved, but I could not hear his words through the tinnitus. He grabbed my arm, the ruined left one, and pain white-hot and absolute punched through the numbness. He shoved a new lasgun into my hands, pulled a fresh power pack from his coat, and slammed it into the weapon, his movements speaking the orders his voice could not convey. I was being redeployed immediately. There was another position that required clearing, another enemy strongpoint that needed revelation through sacrifice. I had survived. Therefore, I remained useful. Therefore, I would continue. The cycle repeated. Deploy, fight, survive or die. Return if survival occurred. Deploy again. Weeks became months, became years. Though I lost the ability to track time in any meaningful sense. My body accumulated damage faster than it could heal, each new wound layering atop old injuries until I became a palimpsest of violence. My flesh rewritten so many times that the original text was unrecoverable. I lost 3 fingers on my right hand to frostbite on an ice world whose name I never learned. I lost vision in my left eye when shrapnel from a grenade I had thrown bounced off a wall and returned to remove a portion of my face. I lost hearing in both ears gradually, the cumulative effect of explosions and gunfire and the constant screaming, until the world became muffled and distant. Communication reduced to reading lips and interpreting gestures. I stopped resembling the thing I had been on Varsavia Prime. That person had died in increments so small that no single moment marked the transition from human to whatever I had become. The face I glimpsed in the reflection of broken windows and pools of water was not mine. It belonged to a stranger, a thing made of scar tissue and hate, its eyes flat and dead, and carrying the weight of crimes too numerous to confess. I killed a Commissar during my 68th deployment, not in combat, not as an act of rebellion, but because the systems had degraded to the point where recognition was no longer reliable. We were in close quarters, fighting in a hive city's lower levels, the corridors so dark that visibility was measured in meters, and a figure emerged from a side passage wearing the wrong silhouette. I fired on instinct, the last bolt catching him in the throat, and only after he fell did I realize the greatcoat, the peaked cap, the insignia of rank that marked him as Imperial authority. I waited for the collar to activate, for the kill switch to trigger, for the punishment that would certainly follow such a transgression. But nothing happened. My collar remained dormant. The VoxNet crackled with damage reports and tactical updates, but no alarm was raised about the Commissar's death. I stared at the body, understanding slowly filtering through my exhaustion. In the chaos of deployment, in the confusion of combat, death was death. Identity was secondary to the simple fact of cessation. The Commissar had died in battle, and whether his death came from enemy action or friendly fire or simple accident was irrelevant to the system. He would be logged as a combat casualty, his position filled by the next ambitious martinet in the chain of command, and the machine would continue grinding forward without pause. I had killed Imperial authority, and the Imperium had not noticed and would not care. This was the truth they could not speak. We penal designates were not monitored because we were dangerous, but because monitoring systems cost resources, and resources must be allocated efficiently. The collar was not sophisticated surveillance. It was a kill switch to be activated if we deviated from expected behavior patterns. But in the middle of a war zone, all behavior patterns deviated, and the system adapted by simply not caring. I began to see other penal designates differently after that, not as fellow sufferers or temporary companions, but as components in the same machine that was grinding us all down to constituent elements. We were not a unit. We were not brothers in arms. We were parallel processes running toward the same termination state, occasionally intersecting, but never truly connecting. The man who fought beside me in one deployment would be dead in the next, or reassigned to a different wave, or simply vanished from the roster without explanation. And I would find myself fighting beside someone else whose designation I would not learn, and whose face I would not remember, because memory was waste, and waste was sin. We did not speak to each other anymore, those of us who had survived beyond the expected parameters. Speech required the belief that communication mattered, that our thoughts and experiences had value worth sharing. But we had learned that value was measured in ammunition expended and enemies revealed, and the seconds we drew fire before dying, and none of those metrics required speech. Silence was more efficient. Silence was more honest. We moved through the battles like ghosts, present but not participating in any meaningful sense. Our actions reduced to stimulus response patterns that required no conscious thought. Point toward the enemy. Pull the trigger. Die efficiently. And if dying did not occur, repeat until it did. The closest thing to human connection I experienced in the latter years came from a woman whose designation I never learned, but whose presence became familiar through repeated deployments. We kept ending up in the same assault waves, assigned to the same drop ships, deployed to the same killing grounds. And after the 7th or 8th time this occurred, I began to recognize the pattern of her movements. The way she favored her right leg, because her left had been shattered and poorly healed. The way she held her laser gun canted slightly to compensate for a shoulder injury that limited her range of motion. We never spoke. We never acknowledged each other directly. But in the chaos of combat, I found myself unconsciously positioning to cover her flanks, and she would do the same for me, our movements coordinating without conscious thought or communicated intent. This was not friendship. Friendship required identity. required the investment of self in another's existence. This was just pattern recognition, just two damaged systems running compatible protocols and achieving marginally better survival rates through unintentional cooperation. She died during deployment 71, her collar detonating without warning while we were advancing across open ground. There was no reason for it, no obvious deviation from expected behavior, just the sudden activation of the kill switch and the wet explosion that removed her head and both shoulders. I continued advancing because stopping was not permitted. Her body fell behind me. The pattern recognition software in my brain registered the absence and adjusted, and whatever marginal improvement her presence had contributed to my survival, probability was silently recalculated downward. I realized during deployment 83 that I had forgotten my original crime. The memory had simply dissolved over the years, worn away by repetition and trauma and the thousands of crimes I had committed since, until the thing that had brought me to Varsavia Prime was lost beneath the weight of everything that had followed. I remembered a trial, remembered standing before a judge, remembered the word seditious being spoken, but the specifics had blurred into abstraction. Had I spoken against the Imperium? Had I failed to report something? Had I simply been in the wrong place when quotas needed filling? The answer did not matter anymore. Whatever I had been guilty of originally was so vastly outweighed by what I had become that the initial transgression was rendered meaningless by comparison. I was guilty now, not of one crime, but of hundreds, thousands. The mathematics of murder written in the bodies I had created, and the suffering I had witnessed, and the simple fact of my continued survival in a system designed for disposal. If I ever stood trial again, if the Imperium somehow reconsidered my sentence and hauled me before another judge, what would the charges be? Failure to die? Inefficient resource consumption? Surviving beyond predicted parameters? These were the real crimes now. The thing I had done on whatever world I had come from, in whatever life I had lived before this one, was trivial by comparison. The deployments began to change after I passed my 100th. I became one of the anomalies the system feared. One of the ghosts who had outlived their statistical expectation by such a margin that my continued existence raised questions in administratum reports and commissarial briefings. I saw it in the way officers looked at me. A moment of hesitation, a brief consultation of data slates, a recalculation of probabilities. I was assigned to increasingly desperate operations, deployed to positions where survival was not merely improbable, but mathematically impossible. The Imperium attempting to dispose of me through missions so lethal that even my inexplicable survival rate would finally meet its terminus. I walked through firestorms that turned entire regiments to ash. I advanced across killing grounds where the enemy had established overlapping fields of fire so perfect that every centimeter of approach was covered by multiple weapon systems. I was deployed without equipment, without ammunition, with orders to advance unarmed into enemy positions and create disruption through the simple act of dying in their midst. I survived all of it, not through skill or courage or any quality that might be admirable, but through the random distribution of probability that occasionally favors impossible outcomes, despite all expectation to the contrary. Last bolts missed me by margins measured in millimeters. Artillery struck moments after I had moved from the impact zone. Enemies failed to fire at exactly the moment when firing would have killed me. I became an affront to statistics, a walking violation of the mathematics that governed warfare and death. The commissars stopped talking to me. They would issue orders through Vox systems or through intermediaries, but direct communication ceased. I had become contaminated by my own survival, marked by the superstitious dread that attaches to those who should be dead, but inexplicably are not. Some of the other penal designates began to follow me during deployments, staying close during advances, believing that proximity to my impossible luck might confer some protection. They were always wrong. They died in the same numbers as those who stayed distant. My survival did not extend to others. It was personal, specific, a statistical aberration that applied only to my own existence and could not be shared or transferred. I watched them die around me, watched their hope transform to terror when they realized that my survival was not a shield, but an indictment, that if I lived and they died, it only proved that the universe was selective in its cruelty, that some were marked for continuation and others for termination, and the marking was arbitrary and final. The longest I went without deployment was 6 days. This occurred after deployment 117, when I was wounded severely enough that even the Imperium's generous definition of functional could not classify me as fit for immediate combat duty. An orc's choppa had opened my abdomen from sternum to pelvis, my intestines spilling into my hands as I fell, and only immediate battlefield surgery by a medicae who was likely as surprised as I was by his own intervention prevented me from bleeding out in the mud. They stapled me back together, literally stapled the wound closed with industrial fasteners intended for ship hull repair, and threw me in a recovery ward where 200 other damaged components were slowly determining whether they would return to functional status or progress to disposal. I lay on a cot that was too short, my legs hanging off the end, my body screaming with pain that the minimal anesthesia could not fully suppress. And I stared at the ceiling and counted the hours. 6 days, 144 hours of not being deployed, of not fighting, of existing in a liminal space where I was temporarily excused from the cycle of violence that had defined my existence for so long that I no longer remembered what other modes of being might feel like. It should have been relief. It should have been rest. Instead, it was torture. The absence of immediate danger, the silence of non-combat, the time to think and remember and understand what I had become. These were harder to endure than enemy fire. On the 6th day, I walked out of the recovery ward, my wound still seeping through the bandages, and reported for deployment assignment because the alternative was consciousness. Consciousness was unendurable. They deployed me alone during assignment 132. This was unprecedented, or at least unprecedented in my experience. But by that point, the normal rules had ceased to apply. I was loaded onto a dropship with no other personnel, given a satchel charge and minimal instructions, and told that my objective was to destroy a fuel depot behind enemy lines. No support, no extraction plan, no expectation of survival. Just a target and the understanding that my death was the primary objective, with the depot's destruction being a secondary benefit if I somehow managed to reach it before dying. The drop was at night, my pod impacting in a forest 20 kilometers from the target, and I walked through darkness so complete that I could not see my hands when I held them before my face. I navigated by sound and by the faint heat signature of the distant depot, my vision having degraded enough over the years that darkness and light were becoming increasingly similar, both reduced to vague suggestions of geometry and motion. It took me 3 days to reach the depot, 3 days of moving through enemy-controlled territory, of hiding when patrols passed, of stealing water from streams contaminated with chemical runoff that made me violently ill, but was preferable to dehydration. I reached the depot on the 3rd night, placed the satchel charge against a primary fuel tank, set the timer for maximum delay, and walked away. The explosion occurred 30 minutes later, a fireball that rose 300 meters into the air and could probably be seen from orbit, and I was 5 kilometers distant when the shock wave reached me, the pressure wave knocking me flat but leaving me alive. I waited for extraction that never came. I waited for new orders that never arrived. I waited because waiting was the only action available, and after 2 days of waiting, I began walking toward the sound of distant battle, toward the last fire and the screaming, because that was where I belonged. That was my natural habitat, the only environment I understood anymore. I walked for 6 days before encountering Imperial forces. They found me shambling through a battlefield that had been contested and abandoned, the ground covered in bodies from both sides and scavengers, things that might have been animals or might have been something else, tearing at the dead. I was challenged by a guardsman who raised his lasgun with shaking hands, his voice breaking as he demanded my identification. I tried to speak my designation, but the numbers would not come. The sequence lost somewhere in the fog of exhaustion and dehydration and the simple failure of memory systems that had been overused beyond their design tolerances. I pulled open my shirt to show the identification plate stapled to my sternum, the numbers still visible beneath the layers of scar tissue that had formed around it. The Guardsman voxed his sergeant, who voxed his lieutenant, who voxed someone else up the chain of command, and eventually a Commissar arrived, his face young and his eyes uncertain, and he consulted a data slate for what felt like hours before finally nodding. "Penal designates 7743 Delta Sigma 9, he said, reading from the screen. "Reported KIA 6 days ago, following deployment to enemy fuel depot. Status error requires correction." He made a notation on the data slate, officially resurrecting me from the dead, and assigned me to the nearest Penal Legion assault wave. I had died, and the Imperium had documented my death, and now I lived again, and that living was just another administrative error, to be corrected through proper forms and continued deployment. I stopped counting deployments after 150. The number became meaningless. Just another data point in a series that would either terminate eventually or continue indefinitely. And I found I no longer cared which outcome manifested. I had reached a state beyond despair, beyond hope, beyond any emotional response to my circumstances. I simply existed, moving through battles like weather moves through a landscape, present but not participating in any meaningful sense. My consciousness reduced to the basic processes of survival. Breathe, move, shoot, survive if possible. And if survival was not possible, then die, and let the universe sort out the administrative details. Other penal designates came and went, their faces and designations flowing past like water. And I remained, a permanent fixture in a system designed for temporary occupation, an error in the calculations that no one had figured out how to correct. The Commissars watched me with increasing unease. The other penal designates avoided me when possible. Even the enemies I faced seemed to hesitate sometimes, their weapons tracking me and then shifting to other targets, as if some unconscious recognition of my abnormality made me unworthy of the ammunition required to kill me. I had become a ghost in the machine, a presence that existed in defiance of expectation, and the universe itself seemed uncertain how to process my continued survival. The end, when it finally came, was not dramatic. There was no final battle, no moment of sacrifice or redemption, no meaning extracted from the accumulated suffering of years. I was simply called to a Commissar's office on Corvost 9, escorted by 2 guards who would not meet my eyes, and told that my service was being terminated. Not completed, not fulfilled, terminated. The Commissar was old, his face a relief map of scars and augmetic implants, and he did not look at me as he read from the data slate. Penal designate 7743 Delta Sigma 9 has exceeded expected service duration by unacceptable margins. Continued deployment creates administrative complications and threatens operational efficiency. Immediate termination authorized under Administratum Directive 777 Omega. He looked up then, and I saw something in his eyes that might have been pity, or might have been disgust, or might have been simple fatigue with the necessities of his position. "Do you understand?" he asked. I understood. I had survived so long that my survival had become a problem, a question that the system could not answer except through my removal. The Imperium could not allow the damned to outlive their damnation. It threatened the entire philosophy of disposability that the Penal Legions represented. I nodded, and the Commissar gestured to the guards, and they led me from the office toward the execution chambers. The walk was longer than it needed to be. Down corridors I had walked countless times during processing and redeployment, past barracks where new penal designates were being integrated into the system that would consume them. I saw faces pressed to the windows, watching me pass, their eyes wide with the fear of recognition. This would be them eventually. This was everyone's destination. The only variables were time and chance, and I had exhausted both. The execution chamber was clean, sterile, the walls white and the floor polished to a shine that reflected the overhead lighting with crystalline clarity. A servo skull waited in the corner, its recording equipment active, documenting the proceedings for some archive that would never be reviewed. I was positioned against a wall. No restraints, no ceremony. Just a man standing in a room, waiting for the inevitable. The commissar who followed us in was not the same one from the office. This one was younger, his face unmarked by experience, and he held his bolt pistol with the careful grip of someone who had practiced the motion but not yet internalized it. He raised the weapon. I looked at him and felt nothing. No fear, no anger, no relief, just empty recognition of an ending. He pulled the trigger, and the bolt round took me in the chest, punching through my sternum and my identification plate and everything behind it, and I felt the explosion inside my torso, felt my body come apart from the inside out, and then I felt nothing at all. I died in a white room on Corvast 9, my body collapsing to the clean floor, my blood pooling in patterns that meant nothing to anyone. The commissar made a notation on his data slate. The servo skull recorded the disposal for archival purposes. The guards dragged my corpse to the incinerators, where it would be burned to ash, and the ash scattered to the winds. Penal Designate 7743, Delta Sigma 9, was officially terminated. His designation freed for reassignment. His impossible survival finally corrected through proper administrative channels. The Imperium doesn't send the damned to die. It sends them to remind the living why obedience feels safer than hope. I learned this truth across 150 deployments, and however many years they consumed. My life spent as a lesson written in blood for audiences who would never read it, and soldiers who would never understand what message my suffering was meant to convey. The Penal Legions are not punishment for crimes committed. They are prevention of crimes not yet imagined. The visible consequence of deviation made so terrible that the vast majority of humanity never deviates at all. Every person who sees us march in chains, who watches us die in waves against fortifications that real soldiers will later capture with minimal casualties, who hears the stories of the damned who fought for years without hope or future. Every one of them performs the calculation. They measure their discontent against our suffering. They weigh their grievances against our fate. And they choose silence. They choose obedience. They choose the safety of conformity over the risk of our existence. This is the Penal Legion's true function, not to punish the guilty, but to terrorize the innocent into never becoming guilty in the first place. We are not soldiers or convicts or even slaves. We are scarecrows planted in humanity's collective consciousness, warnings etched in flesh, our screaming transformed into the lullaby that keeps the Imperium's children in their beds at night. I died having served that purpose perfectly, my impossible survival extending the lesson across years and deployments until even my death became instructive, a proof that no anomaly can persist indefinitely, that the system ultimately corrects all errors, that survival beyond expected parameters is just delayed disposal, and the disposal when it comes is final and absolute. They burned my body and scattered the ashes and freed my designation for the next condemned soul who would wear it for however long their utility lasted, and the machine continued grinding forward without pause or recognition of my passage through it. This is what the Imperium understands that individuals cannot. We are not unique, not irreplaceable, not meaningful beyond our momentary function. We are components. We are resources. We are expendable in the truest sense of that word, meant to be spent and forgotten and replaced with interchangeable units that will perform the same function we performed until they too are consumed and replaced. The Penal Legions eat their designated and shit out corpses, and the cycle continues forever, or at least for as long as the Imperium persists, which amounts to the same thing from the perspective of those being consumed. And somewhere on Varsavia Prime, or perhaps on another processing station on another world, a man or woman whose crime was silence or speech or simple misfortune is having an identification plate stapled to their sternum, their name replaced with a number, their future compressed into the singular destiny of deployment and death. They do not know yet what they are becoming. They still believe they are being punished. They still think this is about justice. But they will learn, as I learned, as everyone learns, who survives long enough to understand. The Penal Legions exist because death is mercy, and mercy is too expensive to waste on the damned. They will learn this truth in fire and blood and the endless grinding of wars they cannot win. They will learn it when they kill their first enemy, their 10th, their 100th. They will learn it when they watch others die around them and realize their survival is not blessing, but curse. They will learn it when their bodies fail and fail and fail again, but somehow continue functioning, when their minds break under the weight of accumulated horror but consciousness persists anyway, when they understand finally and completely that they are not dying slowly, but rather living slowly in a state that exists beyond death, a punishment that extends infinitely, because infinity is more efficient than execution. And when they have learned these things, when they have been ground down to component elements and rebuilt into weapons that require no faith or loyalty or belief to function, they will understand what I understood in that white room on Corvost 9. The Imperium doesn't need to love us. It doesn't need to respect us. It doesn't even need to remember us. It just needs us to scream loudly enough that others hear and choose silence instead of becoming the next voice in the chorus. That is all we ever were. That is all any of us will ever be. Warnings, lessons, scarecrows planted in fields of human consciousness to keep the harvest in line. We died so others would fear dying. We suffered so others would fear suffering. We existed so others would fear existence outside the narrow parameters of acceptable behavior. This was always the point. This was always the plan. The Penal Legions are working exactly as intended, and our damnation is proof of their success.